To understand the tragedy of what was lost, we must first understand the sheer scale of what existed. We often think of Pompeii as the center of the disaster of 79 AD, but Pompeii was a bustling commercial hub, a city of merchants, brothels, and bakeries. Herculaneum, located just a few miles up the coast, was different. Herculaneum was the Beverly Hills of the ancient world. It was a resort town where the ultra-wealthy of Rome came to escape the heat and politics of the capital. And among all the mansions lining that coast, one house stood apart. It was so massive, so opulent and culturally significant that when it was first rediscovered in the 18th century, explorers thought they had found a city, not a residence. This was the Villa of the Papyri. Imagine a structure stretching over 250 meters along the coastline, dropping down in terraces toward the sea. It was not merely a home, it was a statement of power and intellect. It possessed a swimming pool as long as a modern Olympic stadium, surrounded by gardens filled with the finest bronze statuary ever created in the ancient world. Statues of runners, wrestlers, and philosophers that seemed to breathe in the Mediterranean sun. But who owned this palace? The evidence points to one man, Lucius Calpurnius Piso Caesoninus. Piso was not just a rich man, he was a titan of the late Roman Republic. He was the father-in-law of Julius Caesar. While Caesar was conquering Gaul and reshaping the world with the sword, Piso was here, in the shadow of Mount Vesuvius, reshaping the world with the mind. Piso was a patron of the arts, a man of deep, if controversial, taste. He was the protector of the philosopher Philodemus of Gadara, an Epicurean thinker who lived within the villa's walls. This distinction is vital. This villa was not just a showpiece of gold and marble. It was a working center of philosophy. It was an Epicurean commune. Epicureanism was a philosophy often misunderstood as the pursuit of gluttony, but in reality it was the pursuit of arataxia, freedom from fear, and aponia, the absence of pain. They believed that the gods did not interfere in human affairs, that death was nothing to be feared, and the highest good was simple pleasure and friendship. Picture the scene in the year 75 AD, just 4 years before the end. The cool sea breeze sweeping through the peristyle gardens, the sound of water trickling from 100 fountains. In the covered colonnades, Philodemus and Piso walking side by side, debating the nature of the soul, while scribes in the library meticulously copied Greek texts onto fresh papyrus rolls. The library was the heart of the house. It was small by modern standards, a room perhaps 3 meters by 3 meters, lined with wooden shelves reaching the ceiling. In the center stood a wooden table where the scribes worked. In the cabinets lay nearly 2,000 scrolls, mostly Greek philosophy, treatises on music, rhetoric, and death. It was a specialized, private collection, intended for the deepest of thinkers. To the people living there, this world must have felt eternal. The Roman peace, the Pax Romana, was at its height. The mountain that loomed above them, Vesuvius, was green and fertile. Vines grew up its slopes. It had been silent for centuries. They had no word for volcano in their language because they did not know it was one. They thought it was just a mountain. They sat in their gardens, surrounded by bronze statues of satyrs and gods, reading treatises on how the world was made of atoms, believing they had conquered fear. They believed that by understanding nature, they were safe from it. They were wrong. The irony of the Villa of the Papyri is that the very philosophy studied there, the idea that death is the end and the soul dissolves, was about to be tested on a scale they could not imagine. The mountain was waking up. Deep beneath the marble floors and the long swimming pool, the earth was groaning. The water in the wells was beginning to taste strange. Small tremors were cracking the plaster on the frescoes. But in the summer of 79 AD, the
The library was still open, the scrolls were still being read, and the master of the house looked out over the Bay of Naples, unaware that he was standing on top of the greatest time capsule history would ever create.
The end of the ancient world did not happen all at once. It began shortly after noon, likely in late October of 79 AD. A deafening crack shattered the silence of the Bay of Naples, followed by a pillar of ash and pumice shooting 30 kilometers into the stratosphere. It looked, as Pliny the Younger famously wrote, like a Mediterranean pine tree, a tall trunk of smoke spreading out into branches at the top. But here is the crucial detail that sealed the fate of the library: the wind. On that particular day, the wind was blowing to the southeast. This meant that the falling debris, the lapilli stones and hot ash, rained down heavily on Pompeii, burying it quickly. But Herculaneum, located to the west of the volcano, was largely spared during the first few hours. The villa of the Papyri was not immediately buried. The sky turned black. Earthquakes shook the marble floors, and the sea became turbulent, but the deadly rain of fire was falling elsewhere. This pause was a trap. It gave the residents of the villa a false sense of hope. Some fled immediately, clutching their jewelry and coins. Others, perhaps the stubborn or the sick, stayed behind, hoping the worst was over. In the library, the scrolls sat undisturbed on their shelves. The scribes had likely fled, leaving the papyrus rolls exposed to the trembling air. For hours, the volcano merely threatened them, but as night fell, the internal structure of the eruption column became unstable. Shortly after midnight, the massive column of ash collapsed under its own weight. It didn't fall up, it fell down, cascading down the slopes of the mountain at 100 miles per hour. This is called a pyroclastic surge, a superheated avalanche of gas, ash, and rock. It is one of the most destructive forces in nature. The first surge hit Herculaneum with the force of a nuclear blast wave. But unlike Pompeii, where people were suffocated by ash, the heat in Herculaneum was much more intense, estimated at nearly 500 degrees Celsius. It was a thermal shock so instantaneous that it vaporized the soft tissues of the victims huddled in the boathouses on the beach. They died in a fraction of a second, their bodies frozen in time. When this superheated gas wave hit the villa of the Papyri, it did something miraculous to the library. If the temperature had been slightly higher, the scrolls would have vanished into dust. If it had been slightly lower, they might have rotted away over the centuries. Instead, the intense oxygen-deprived heat carbonized the papyrus. Think of it like putting a piece of bread in a toaster and forgetting it. It turns black, it shrinks, and it becomes brittle charcoal, but it keeps its shape. The text written on the scrolls was not burned off, it was baked in. The organic material of the papyrus turned into pure carbon, preserving the geometry of the spiral rolls perfectly. Then came the second phase, the mud. Following the gas surges, massive flows of volcanic material mixed with groundwater and debris slammed into the city. It wasn't soft mud, it was a dense, boiling slurry of liquid rock. This sludge filled the villa of the Papyri from floor to ceiling. It flowed into the library, gently surrounding the carbonized scrolls, packing them into a solid block. It filled the swimming pool. It toppled the statues, knocking the drunken satyr into the dirt. It buried the entire coastline, extending the land 400 meters out into the sea. When the eruption finally stopped, the villa wasn't just buried, it was erased. Over the next few days, this mud hardened, but it didn't harden into soft soil like at Pompeii. It hardened into tuff, a rock almost as hard as concrete. The library was now sealed inside a stone tomb, 20 meters below the new surface of the earth. The Roman world moved on.
Survivors likely returned to the site, but looking down at the hardened gray wasteland, they realized there was no digging it out. The villa was gone. The map had changed. And as the centuries turned into millennia, the very name Herculaneum was forgotten. Farmers planted vines and olive trees on the fertile soil above, having no idea that 20 meters beneath their roots, a library of 1,800 books was waiting in the dark, black and brittle, but alive.
Silence fell over the Bay of Naples. Where once there had been a bustling coastline of villas and ports, there was now only a gray, smoking plain. The shoreline itself had moved. The sea had been pushed back nearly half a kilometer by the sheer volume of volcanic debris. The villa of the Papyri was no longer on the coast. It was now inland, buried under a blanket of material that was cooling into a tomb. It is important to understand exactly why Herculaneum remained hidden for so long, while its sister city, Pompeii, was known and looted for centuries. The difference lies in the rock. Pompeii was buried mostly in loose ash and pumice stones, soft, light material that could be dug through with a simple shovel. Survivors returned to Pompeii almost immediately, tunneling into their houses to recover statues and money. Pompeii was porous. Air and water seeped in, rotting away wood and fabric over the centuries. But Herculaneum was different. The pyroclastic surge had encased it in a material called tuffo, tough. As this volcanic mud dried, it became a rock almost as hard as concrete. To reach the villa of the Papyri, you didn't need a shovel, you needed a pickaxe and a chisel. And you didn't need to dig down 4 meters, you needed to dig down 20 meters, the height of a 6-story modern building. Because of this impenetrable shield, the library entered a state of perfect suspended animation. It was an accidental preservation chamber. The hardening rock created an anaerobic seal, an airtight environment with no oxygen. Without oxygen, the bacteria could not survive to eat the organic papyrus. Without oxygen, the carbonized scrolls could not decompose. They were locked in a stable chemical stasis, waiting for a future that could understand them. Above ground, the world changed. The Roman Empire, which seemed eternal to Piso and his guests, began to crumble. The capital moved to Constantinople. The Goths and Vandals swept through Italy. The great aqueducts were broken, and the marble of the Colosseum was stripped to build churches. Throughout the Dark Ages, humanity effectively forgot that Herculaneum had ever existed. A new town grew up on the hardened volcanic plateau. It was called Resina. Medieval peasants built their humble stone houses, planted their vineyards, and dug their wells, completely unaware that they were walking directly on top of the most luxurious palace of antiquity. They lived their entire lives, loved, fought, and died, separated by only 20 meters of rock from the sleeping statues of Greek philosophers. While the villa slept, the rest of the world's ancient knowledge was being systematically destroyed. The great library of Alexandria was lost. The imperial library of Constantinople was burned by crusaders. The monastic libraries of Europe were ravaged by fire and damp. By the year 1000 A.D., the vast majority of Greek literature, the plays of Sophocles, the poems of Sappho, the philosophy of Epicurus, had vanished from the face of the earth. Scholars of the Renaissance, like Petrarch and Boccaccio, scoured monasteries for scraps of Latin text, weeping over the lost wisdom of the ancients. They had no idea that the greatest concentration of that wisdom was not in a monastery, but under a vineyard in southern Italy.
The Villa of the Papyri had become a ghost story without a ghost. It was a physical paradox. The destruction of the city had ensured its survival. If Vesuvius had never erupted, the papyrus scrolls would have been eaten by worms or thrown away as trash by later generations who couldn't read Greek. The volcano was not the villain of this story, it was the curator. For 16 centuries the long sleep continued. The rock held firm. Roots from the vines above tried to penetrate it but failed. Earthquakes occasionally shook the ground, but the frozen mud held the library tight. It would take a random accident, a desire for fresh water, to break the seal. The year is 1709. The Renaissance has passed. The age of enlightenment is beginning. In the town of Resina, a peasant farmer named Ambrogio Nucerino is unhappy with his well. It isn't deep enough. He decides to dig deeper, hammering his way down through the strange, hard, gray rock. He doesn't know it, but his pickaxe is about to strike the roof of a theater, and the sound of that strike will wake the dead.
The discovery of Herculaneum began with a sound. It was the clink of metal striking stone. In 1709, the peasant Ambrogio Nucerino was deepening his well in the town of Resina. He was looking for water, but instead he pulled up fragments of marble, rare, polished, and beautifully colored giallo antico. He didn't know it, but he had drilled straight down onto the stage of the ancient theater of Herculaneum. In any other time, Nucerino might have just sold the marble for scrap, but luck was strange in 1709. A French nobleman, the Prince d'Elbeuf, was living nearby. He was a commander of the Austrian cavalry, a man of expensive tastes who was building his own seaside villa. He needed crushed marble to make plaster for his walls. When he saw the high-quality stone coming out of Nucerino's well, he didn't just buy the stone, he bought the land. The Prince d'Elbeuf was not an archaeologist. The word archaeology barely existed. He was, for all intents and purposes, a looter. He ordered workers to widen the well shaft and dig sideways. They had no maps, no safety equipment, and no electric lights. They descended into the earth with torches, crawling into the voids left by the ancient eruption. What followed was less of an excavation and more of a robbery. For months, the prince's men tunneled through the solidified volcanic rock like moles. When they hit a wall, they smashed through it. When they found a fresco, they often hacked it off the wall or destroyed it to see what was behind it. They were hunting for one thing only: statues, and they found them. In the darkness of the buried theater, they stumbled upon 3 perfectly preserved marble statues of women draped in robes, the Herculaneum women. These were masterpieces of Roman art. The prince had them hoisted up the narrow well shaft on ropes, swinging and banging against the sides before shipping them off to his Austrian relatives as gifts. For several years, this mining continued. It was a chaotic, destructive process. They stripped the marble facing off the theater walls. They took columns. But crucially, they never reached the Villa of the Papyri. The villa lay further to the west, still sleeping, still safe from the prince's clumsy pickaxes. But the political winds shifted. The Austrians lost control of Naples, and the Prince d'Elbeuf was forced to flee. The excavations were halted. The tunnels were abandoned, left to fill with foul air and water. The well was covered up. For another 20 years, silence returned to the underground city. However, the secret was out. The statues the prince had sent to Vienna caused a sensation in the courts of Europe. Kings and queens whispered about a magical underground cavern in Naples where art could be plucked from the walls like fruit. In 1738, a new king took the throne of Naples, King Charles VII of the Bourbon dynasty. King Charles was young, ambitious, and wanted Naples to be the cultural capital of the world. He remembered the stories of the princes well. He didn't just want a few statues for his garden, he wanted the glory of Rome for his crown. King Charles ordered the reopening of the tunnels, but this time he appointed a director to oversee the work. It was a military operation run by Spanish engineers. They were about to push the tunnels further than the prince ever dared. They were about to dig their way west, away from the theater and towards the sea. They were blindly tunneling towards the greatest discovery of them all, the library. By 1750, the excavations at Herculaneum were technically under the control of a Spanish military engineer named Roque Joaquin de Alcubierre. Alcubierre was a man of action, but he was also a man of impatience. He viewed the site as a mine. If a tunnel didn't yield statues or gold within a few days, he ordered it abandoned and collapsed. He was destroying the site in his haste to loot it. History needed a savior, and it found one in his assistant, a calm, methodical Swiss soldier named Karl Weber. Karl Weber was different. He was an architect by training, a man who believed that where an object was found was just as important as the object itself. While Alcubierre screamed for more statues to send to the king, Weber quietly began to do something revolutionary. He started to draw. He mapped every tunnel, every wall, and every corridor. He was the first person to realize that they weren't just digging into random rubble, they were exploring a coherent, frozen city. The work was terrifying. Imagine digging a tunnel barely 1.5 meters high through solid rock, 20 meters underground, lit only by the flickering flame of a tallow candle. The air was thick with dust and the smell of sulfur. The workers were constantly threatened by mofeta, pockets of toxic carbon dioxide gas that seeped out of the volcanic rock. If a worker's torch suddenly went out, they had seconds to run before they suffocated. Despite these nightmares, Weber pressed on. In 1750, his men broke through a wall into a space that was different from the others. It wasn't a public building. It was a floor paved with an intricate geometric mosaic of colored marble. They followed the floor, tunneling sideways like ants in a colony. They found columns, then more columns, then a circular terrace overlooking the buried coastline. Weber realized they had found a house, but it was a house of impossible proportions. As his tunnels extended week after week, the map grew larger and larger. They discovered a peristyle garden, a courtyard surrounded by columns that was 100 meters long. They found fountains, bronze deer, and sleeping fawns. Alcubierre was delighted by the statues, but Weber was obsessed with the architecture. He meticulously measured the spacing of the columns. He noted the color of the paint on the walls, still vivid red and yellow after 1,700 years. He was creating the famous Pianta de Weber, a detailed floor plan that remains our primary guide to the villa today. Without this drawing, we would know almost nothing about the building's layout, because shortly after he mapped it, the tunnels were filled back in with earth to prevent collapse. But the tension between the two men grew. Alcubierre mocked Weber's slow pace. He didn't care about floor plans, he wanted treasure. He pressured the workers to dig faster, ignoring Weber's safety protocols. This conflict defined the excavation, the clash between the treasure hunter and the archaeologist. Then, in October 1752, Weber's men reached a small, unassuming room just off the main peristyle. It wasn't grand, it didn't have gold leaf on the walls. It was barely 3 meters wide. The floor was covered in a strange, bumpy layer of black material. The workers kicked at the debris. It looked like charcoal, perhaps the remains of a woodpile or a burned piece of furniture. They were disappointed. They were looking for bronze or silver. To them, these black, cylindrical lumps were just trash. Some of the workers actually used this charcoal to light their fires to keep warm in the damp tunnels. Others threw it onto the spoil heap to be carted away. They had no idea that they were burning the lost works of Epicurus. They had found the library, but they didn't recognize it. It would take a sharp eye to notice that these pieces of charcoal were perfectly shaped and that they were rolled.
The villa of the Papyri gave up its secrets reluctantly. For weeks, the workers had been tossing aside the strange, black, cylindrical lumps found in the small room. They were light, brittle, and looked exactly like carbonized wood. Some were broken into pieces by pickaxes. Others were simply shoveled into baskets and hauled to the surface to be discarded. The tragedy of how many masterpieces were lost in those first few days is something scholars still struggle to accept. The turning point came when a few of these lumps were brought to the attention of Camillo Paderni, the keeper of the Royal Museum in Portici. Paderni was a man of sharp intellect and deep curiosity. He picked up one of the cylinders. It felt wrong for a piece of wood. It was too uniform. He noticed the center was spiraled, like a rolled carpet. Suspecting something extraordinary, Paderni did something that today would be considered a crime against history, but at the time was the only way to know the truth. He took a knife and sliced the black cylinder lengthwise, right down the middle, splitting it into two halves. Inside, the material was jet black, shiny, and fused together. But as he looked closer, straining his eyes in the sunlight, he saw them. Faint, ghostly marks, lines of structure, and then distinct shapes. They were letters, Greek letters. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't wood. It was a volumen, a papyrus scroll. The black logs were books. The workers hadn't found a wood store. They had found a library, and they had been burning it. Panic and excitement swept through the excavation. Orders were immediately sent down the tunnels. Stop digging. Stop throwing things away. Save every black lump. The workers, now terrified of destroying something valuable, began treating the charcoal with the reverence of gold bars. They collected hundreds of them. Some were bundled together, crushed by the weight of the mud. Others were singular and distinct. But identifying them was only the first battle. The war was just beginning. The scrolls were in a state of terrifying fragility. They were essentially solid blocks of carbon. They were not just burnt, they were fused. The layers of papyrus had stuck together like pages of a wet book that had dried into a brick. Paderni and the scholars of the king's court faced an impossible paradox. They held in their hands the lost literature of the ancient world, works that hadn't been seen for 1,700 years, but they couldn't read them. If they tried to unroll them, the carbonized papyrus would crumble into black dust. If they left them alone, the secrets remained locked inside. Desperation led to destruction. In the early attempts to open them, they tried everything. They soaked them in mercury. They tried to steam them. They used rose water. They used surgical scalpels to peel back the layers one by one. It was a massacre. For every line of text they revealed, they destroyed the layer beneath it. To read page 1, they had to scrape away page 2. Paderni's method of slicing them in half, called scorzatura, allowed them to read the inner text,
but it destroyed the continuity of the book. It was archaeology by amputation. News of the discovery spread across Europe, igniting a frenzy of intellectual jealousy. The King of Naples was the envy of every monarch. He possessed the only library from antiquity. But he also possessed a curse, a library that no one could open without destroying. They needed a machine. They needed a genius, and they would find one in a priest from the Vatican.
By 1753, the situation in the royal palace of Portici was dire. The King of Naples possessed the greatest archaeological treasure in history, yet every attempt to access it resulted in a pile of black dust. The scorzatura method, slicing the scrolls in half, was barbaric. It was destroying the continuity of the texts, giving scholars only disjointed fragments of sentences. They needed a miracle. They needed a way to unroll a piece of charcoal without breaking it. The king sent a request to the Vatican asking for their most skilled conservator. They sent him Father Antonio Piaggio. Piaggio was a piarist priest, a man known not for his speed, but for his obsessive patience. He was a miniaturist, accustomed to painting details so small they could barely be seen with the naked eye. He arrived in Naples with a reputation for being difficult, stubborn, and utterly brilliant. When Piaggio saw the scrolls, he was horrified by what Papyri had done. He immediately declared that the knife method was a crime against history. He refused to use chemicals. He refused to use heat. Instead, he retreated to his workshop and began to build something entirely new. He approached the problem not as a surgeon, but as an engineer. The device he created was a masterpiece of simplicity. It became known as the Macchina di Piaggio. It looked like a small wooden loom. The concept was based on tension and gravity rather than force. He realized that the layers of the papyrus were fused by dampness and pressure, but they weren't welded shut. If he could apply a gentle, constant upward pull, lighter than a human hand could ever achieve, he might be able to separate the layers. Here is how it worked. Piaggio would take a scroll and carefully attach the outer edge of the papyrus to a series of silk threads using a special glue made from gold beater's skin, the thin, tough membrane from the intestine of a cow. These silk threads ran up over the top of the wooden frame and were attached to small turning screws. It was a process of agonizing slowness. Piaggio would turn the screws just a fraction of a millimeter. Then he would wait. He would wait for the glue to set and for the tension to gently coax the carbonized leaf away from the roll. Then he would turn it again. Another fraction, another wait. The king, eager for results, would visit the workshop and ask how many scrolls had been finished. Piaggio would often reply that he had unrolled perhaps 1 inch that week. It was a clash of tempos, the impatience of a monarch versus the geologic time of the scrolls. But Piaggio refused to be rushed. He knew that one mistake, one slip of the finger, and 1,000 years of philosophy would crumble. Slowly, miraculously, it began to work. As the silk threads pulled upward, the black scroll began to unspool. It didn't crack. It didn't turn to dust. It hung there, suspended in the frame, a long, continuous sheet of black carbon. But unrolling it was only half the battle. Reading it was the other. The papyrus was black. The ink was also black. It was black on black. To the untrained eye, it looked like a textured piece of coal, but Piaggio discovered that if you held the unrolled sheet at a specific angle against the light, the ink had a slightly glossy sheen, while the papyrus was matte. Scholars had to copy the text letter by letter, staring at the black sheets until their eyes watered. They worked in shifts, transcribing the ghostly Greek characters onto fresh paper. It was exhausting work, but for the first time they were reading continuous sentences. The first words to emerge from the darkness were not the lost plays of Sophocles or the histories of Rome as everyone had hoped. They were dense, complex arguments about music, pleasure, and the nature of the gods. They were the works of Philodemus, the Epicurean philosopher who had lived in the villa. Piaggio's machine was a triumph. It is still considered one of the first true inventions of modern archaeology. However, it had a fatal flaw. It took years to unroll a single scroll. At that speed, it would take centuries to read the entire library. And worse, the machine only worked on the outer layers. As they got closer to the center of the books, the spiral became tighter, the carbon more crushed. The core of the books remained stubbornly locked, awaiting a technology that wouldn't exist for another 250 years. As the first legible sentences began to emerge from Piaggio's machine, the intellectual world of Europe held its breath. Kings, popes, and scholars waited with bated breath. They were expecting the greatest hits of antiquity. They hoped for the lost books of Livy's History of Rome, the missing tragedies of Aeschylus, or perhaps the poems of Sappho. They wanted the foundations of Western civilization. What they got instead was a crushing disappointment. As the scribes translated scroll after scroll, a pattern emerged. They weren't finding the famous classics. They were finding book after book by a man named Philodemus of Gadara. To the 18th century scholars, this was a letdown. Philodemus was considered a minor figure, a footnote in history. It was as if you opened a time capsule from the 20th century hoping to find the works of Einstein and Hemingway, but instead found 1,000 blog posts by a relatively unknown professor. But time has changed our perspective. Today, we realize that this disappointment was actually a stroke of incredible luck. If the library had been filled with famous works like Homer's Iliad, we wouldn't have learned anything new, because we already have copies of the Iliad. But because the library was filled with the obscure, specialized works of Philodemus, we have recovered an entire school of thought that had been largely silenced by history. The library was, in essence, an Epicurean research center. Epicureanism was a philosophy that was deeply misunderstood by the Christians who came later. They painted Epicureans as hedonists, gluttons, and atheists who only cared about sex and food. But the scrolls tell a different story. They reveal a philosophy of profound gentleness and psychological therapy. In treatises with titles like On Anger, On Death, and On Frank Criticism, Philodemus outlines the tetrapharmakos, the four-part cure for the anxieties of the soul. The cure was simple. Don't fear God. The gods exist, but they are perfect and therefore do not care about punishing humans. Don't worry about death. When you are here, death is not. When death is here, you are not. You will never experience being dead. What is good is easy to get. Simple food, friendship, and shelter are enough for happiness. What is terrible is easy to endure. Pain is either short or it is chronic and manageable. Reading these scrolls, the villa comes alive not as a palace of debauchery, but a commune of friends trying to cure each other of anxiety. We find texts on how to manage household economics, how to appreciate music, and even how to be a good king. Texts likely written to influence Piso's powerful Roman friends, perhaps even Julius Caesar himself. However, a nagging question remained. Why was the library almost entirely Greek? In a Roman villa owned by a Roman senator, one would expect a balance. Roman libraries were typically divided into two sections, a Greek wing and a Latin wing. We have found the Greek wing. It was small, cramped, and stuffed with the specific study materials of the resident philosopher. This leads to the most tantalizing theory in all classical archaeology. The Latin library of the Villa of the Papyri has not yet been found. The excavations of the 18th century were tunneled blindly. Carl Weber mapped a large portion of the villa, but not all of it. There are entire levels and wings of the palace that were never penetrated by the Swiss engineer. It is highly probable, almost a statistical certainty, that somewhere in the unexcavated lower levels, or perhaps in a room adjacent to the one Weber found, lies a second library. And in that second library, the greatest hits might actually be waiting. The lost poems of Ennius, the missing books of Tacitus, the autobiography of Augustus, they could be sitting there right now, encased in rock, just a few meters away from where the tourists walk today. The disappointment of the 18th century might simply be because they only opened the first door. For most of the 20th century, the scrolls of Herculaneum lay quiet. The physical unrolling had largely stopped. The risk was simply too high. Every time a conservator touched a scroll, flakes of history fell off. Out of the 1,800 items recovered, hundreds had been destroyed or left as jumbled messes of fragments. Roughly 300 scrolls remained completely intact, tight, calcified cylinders that had never been opened. They sat in glass cases in the National Library of Naples, looking like burned logs, their secrets safe but inaccessible. Then came the digital revolution. In the early 2000s, researchers began to ask a new question. What if we don't have to open them at all? The medical world had perfected the CT scan, computed tomography, which allows doctors to see inside the human brain without cutting it open. Archaeologists wondered if the same technology could virtually unroll a scroll. The initial results were heartbreaking. When they put the scrolls through standard hospital CT scanners, the images came back as gray blobs. The problem was chemistry. In medieval manuscripts, scribes used iron gall ink, which contains heavy metals. Metal blocks X-rays, so the writing lights up bright white on a scan. But the Romans didn't use metal ink. They used lamp black, basically soot and gum. This was the cruel joke of Herculaneum. The papyrus is made of carbon, plant matter. The ink is made of carbon, soot, and the scroll was turned into carbon, charcoal, by the volcano. To an X-ray machine, it all looks exactly the same. It is like trying to find a black cat in a coal cellar at night. Enter Dr. Brent Seals, a computer scientist from the University of Kentucky. He wasn't an archaeologist, he was a data wizard. He believed that even if the ink and papyrus had the same density, the ink must sit on top of the papyrus fibers, creating a microscopic ridge, a thickness of barely a few microns. To see it, they didn't need a hospital scanner. They needed the power of a star. Seals and his team took the scrolls to the Diamond Light Source in the UK, a particle accelerator, synchrotron, that generates X-rays 10 billion times brighter than the sun. The beam was so powerful it could map the internal structure of the scroll at the cellular level. The scans were beautiful, looking like the rings of a tree, but the data was so complex that no human could read it. It was a 3D puzzle of millions of floating particles. Seals realized he couldn't solve it alone. In 2023, he did something unprecedented. He didn't hide the data, he released it to the world. He launched the Vesuvius Challenge, a global competition with $1 million in prize money funded by Silicon Valley investors. The challenge was simple. Here are the 3D scans. The first person to write an AI program that can find the ink wins the money. It was a race between the smartest coders on the planet. They trained machine learning models to detect the subtle crackle pattern where the ink had dried on the fiber. The AI didn't read the Greek. It learned to spot the texture of the ink, distinguishing it from the blank page. In October 2023, a 21-year-old computer science student named Luke Ferreter made the breakthrough. He was sitting in his dorm room, running his code on a small patch of the scroll. Suddenly, a few letters popped out of the noise. Pi, alpha, tau. He had found a word. The word was porphyros, Greek for purple. It was the first time in 2,000 years that a word had been read from inside an unopened scroll. The floodgates opened. Soon, entire paragraphs were being decoded. The text discussed the pleasure of food, the color of tapestries, and the nature of music. The virtual unrolling was no longer a theory. It was a reality. We can now read the books without ever breaking the seal.
The story of the Villa of the Papyri does not end with the Vesuvius challenge. In fact, the most exciting part of the story may be what hasn't happened yet. If you visit Herculaneum today, you will see a deep, open-air pit where the 18th century tunnels have been exposed to the sky. But this represents only a tiny fraction of the villa. The vast majority of the palace, perhaps 60 to 70% of it, is still underground, sealed beneath 20 meters of volcanic rock and the modern town of Herculaneum. We must remember Carl Weber. His tunnels were narrow and targeted. He followed the walls, but he didn't clear the rooms. More importantly, he never reached the lower terraces. The villa was built on a slope dropping down to the sea. We have explored the upper atrium and the peristyle gardens, but the lower levels, the living quarters, the bath complexes, and the storage rooms remain completely untouched. This brings us back to the missing Latin library. In the ancient world, Greek was the language of philosophy, but Latin was the language of history, law, and poetry. It is inconceivable that a man like Piso, a Roman statesman, would not have owned the works of Ennius, Cicero, or the histories of his own republic. Scholars believe that the Philodemus library we found was just a small, private study room. The main library, the grand repository of Roman literature, is likely sitting in one of those unexcavated lower levels. So why don't we just dig it up? We have the technology, we have the maps, we know where it is. The answer is a fierce ethical debate that divides the archaeological world. On one side are the excavators, who argue that leaving the scrolls in the ground is a risk. Seismic activity, rising water tables, or chemical changes could be destroying them right now. They argue that we have a moral duty to recover the lost history of humanity. On the other side are the conservationists. They argue that excavation is destruction. As soon as you expose the villa to the air, it begins to degrade. The frescoes fade, the walls crumble, and the humidity fluctuates. They point to Pompeii, which is slowly falling apart because we cannot afford to maintain what we have already dug up. They argue that the volcanic rock is the safest place for the library. It has kept the books safe for 2,000 years. It can keep them safe for another 100 until our technology is even better. It is a standoff between curiosity and caution. Currently, the Italian government has placed a moratorium on further excavation of the villa. The focus is on preserving what is already exposed. The tunnels are mostly closed. The library sleeps. But the breakthrough of AI and the virtual unrolling has changed the calculus. We no longer need to physically unroll the scrolls. If we could just get them out of the ground, just extract the carbonized lumps, we could read them without damaging them. We wouldn't need to destroy the villa to save the books. Imagine what is down there. The lost books of Livy, which cover the decades of the Roman Republic that are currently a blank page in our history books. The plays of Varius Rufus, considered by the ancients to be the equal of Virgil. The letters of Caesar himself. They are not dust. They are not gone. They are there, right now, physically existing in the dark, stacked on wooden shelves that have turned to charcoal. The Villa of the Papyri is the ultimate time capsule. It is a bank vault where the currency is knowledge. We have spent 3 centuries scratching at the door. We have looted its statues, we have scraped its floors, and we have deciphered its smallest secrets. But the main door, the door to the Latin library, remains locked. Perhaps it is better this way. The mystery keeps the dream alive. Or perhaps, somewhere in a university dorm room or a geology lab, the next Carl Weber or the next Luke Ferreter is preparing the tool that will finally open it. Until then, the villa waits, silent and patient, holding the memory of the world in its black, burnt hands.